I first became interested in architecture as a teenager, and I grew up in Queens, in a nice part of Queens, but it was still Queens, in a neighborhood where there were single-family houses very close together. And I had a good childhood friend who was in his first year at Cooper Union. He had decided to become an architect already, and we would walk around on summer nights in Douglaston, Queens, where I grew up, and we would look at the outside of these modest houses with the lights on and try to figure out how they were laid out on the inside and how people were living in them based on what the outside told us. And that was when I decided I was going to be an architect. My mom was a fashion designer, so design arts were not a stranger to me, but I didn't know any architects at the time, so it was it was a unique decision within my family, certainly, to decide to become an architect. And we do, over the course of my career, and now I've been practicing for 30 years, we do all kinds of things, but I remain drawn to sort of simple expressions in architecture, maybe back to my Queens roots, and my interest in not necessarily the monumental buildings, but more the aspects of everyday life that inform architecture.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about that. I know you've received a lot of accolades for that kind of everyday life, simplicity approach to architecture. How would you explain that to maybe a high school student or somebody even younger? What would be the essence of that kind of expression or movement or approach to approach to architecture?
I'm not sure I'm sorry, that's not a full sentence. My interest in the relationship between everyday life and the built environment has to do with understanding that within the fabric of a city, you can sustain a certain number of monuments. Think of the New York Public Library, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or even spaces like Central Park. These are monuments and they're key to identity, but within that there's also the anonymous fabric. Streets of buildings that have regular rhythms of windows or regular rhythms of front stoops or regular rhythms of storefronts. The sort of backbone and fabric that allows the monument to come forward is to have the fabric in the background. Maybe it's like understanding embroidery on a pair of jeans. You have the regular surface of the denim and then you have this decorative thing on top of it. I'm interested in the regular surface because it contributes so much to who we are.
What do you think is one, for example, you're working, speaking of monuments, right?
Right.
You're involved with the Triangle, remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, and could you tell me a little bit about how you became involved, how you first learned about the story of the Triangle, and what drew you in to participate in the project?
So my interest in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire goes back because I am a multi-generation native New Yorker. So it's a history I knew about. My mother was a fashion designer, and so I was also aware of the history of the fashion industries in New York City. So as a New Yorker, as somebody knowledgeable about the fashion industries, it was of interest to me. And when I was approached about serving on the jury, which is going to judge the submissions for the memorial to the fire, I thought, perfect. It combines so many things I'm interested in: public space, New York City history, the role of the fashion industry in New York City. I suppose I could even add to that list that it was young people, and I'm an educator, so I care about young people. It was mostly women. I consider myself a proponent of women's success in all kinds of fields, so it was mostly young women who died in that fire. That makes it resonant to me. There were just a lot of factors that layered one on top of the other that made me think, ooh, a chance to participate in this? I would love to do that.
In my work, I think a lot about public commemoration. And one of the questions that comes up, especially when we talk about a tragic event like the Triangle Fire, is in what sense does a permanent memorial serve the needs of the people that are there, right? So there's a lot of physical commemoration. Today, for example, people were marching. There's public modern dance performances that occur. Right, the unions come out, the fire trucks raise the ladder, the children lay the flowers. To what extent do you think, or in what ways is a physical, permanent structure needed to help us remember an event like this, as opposed to the physical ritual kind of memorials that occur every year?
Well, I think the physical memorial allows the continuation of the activities to be grounded in a real place. To say we are here in this place at this moment to remember this thing. I mean, the fire is now 102 years ago. So I don't think there's any, in fact, from what I've read, there's no one left alive who survived the fire anymore. The last person died, I believe, at age 107, quite a number of years ago. But there are people who remember people. So we're a generation removed. But we will lose those people soon too. And so as we get further from the event itself, I think making memory physical becomes more important, because the events, the events of a given day of memorial, a speech, a performance, a march, those are very temporal. They evaporate the minute they're over. Yes, you can see them on YouTube, you can search them, you can have taken notes in your diary or snapped a picture, but the physical, permanent reminder, I think, is very important. As I said, it grounds the events going forward. It's a place to march to, a place to stand in front of. It's also a subtle reminder in the context of everyday life. You walk past it and you think, oh, right, that happened here. Or someone who isn't from New York, and you know, we get plenty of visitors, I think 50 million a year, walks by it and says, wow, Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, what was that? Let me learn about that. Let me connect to this city in a different way, in a historic way that might not be front page, that isn't about the Empire State Building and a bus tour and the Statue of Liberty, you know, a little deeper into a sort of grittier, gutsier history than the normal passerby might experience.
Absolutely, I agree with you completely. I think one could even say that when you're walking on that part of NYU's campus, I passed that building 100 times without really realizing that that's where the Triangle Fire took place, right? Just because it's so integrated into NYU's structure.
And I think, you know, particularly in New York City, where things change so quickly, in the moment, you're not really aware of that. You go to Washington Square and you feel that you are in the center of NYU, but in fact, Washington Square has a long history where it was not the center of a university, but actually a residential neighborhood. Much more of a residential neighborhood than it is today, where it feels much more like a portion of an institution. And so understanding that the history of neighborhoods and areas change over time, and that moment is just part of a continuum. I mean, I do find wherever I travel, and I don't mean to reduce the memorial to something as limited as a historical plaque, but even historical plaques that you see on buildings wherever you might be, give you a little window into the history of how that city, or in this case, this city, New York City, changes over time. Cities are organic. So where once people worked in a sweatshop, rows and rows of tables of sewing machines is now the center of a world-class university. That's fascinating too, right? Cities change. So all of these lessons are valuable.
I agree with you. And thinking of the nitty-gritty history of New York, Washington Square Park was a pauper's field. They buried people in a mass grave there and then paved over it so the wealthy people didn't have to overlook a graveyard. So it's an interesting part of the history as well.
It's, I mean, one interesting thing about all cities' history is this kind of evolution over time, and things don't necessarily get better or worse to better. It's a big mixed organic flowing combination of that. But one thing we don't do so much in New York anymore is make things. You know, the banking industry is headed here, the publishing industry is headed here, design, and to a certain extent more and more information technology and digital industries and startups are all based in New York these days. And that's a great thing for New York's current health. But New York's earlier health, albeit at a great expense, was in the making of things. We were more of an industrial city. Things could be made here and shipped to all over the place. And one of the things we made was garments, and the people who worked on those worked in horrific conditions. But the idea of New York as a place where things are made or were made is an important thing to remember, and maybe even an important thing to aspire to in the future, that we could be a city that makes things under better circumstances than people did 100 years ago would be a good thing to look forward to.
Why do you think it's important for cities to be places where things are made rather than places where things are consumed?
It's not a rather than to me, it's in addition to. I think when you're, there are a host of reasons. This is a subject I'm passionate about. I think cities should be places where things are made. One, because it provides a diversity of employment opportunities. Not everybody can work in an information or service sector, nor should they. It brings richness to a place when people do different things. As corny as this sounds, I think making things is satisfying in a way that selling things may not be, or in a different way. But I think it really speaks to the more things that go on in a city, assuming all of them are done in healthy, sustainable ways, the richer life is in that city.
Thank you for your response. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your work with the Triangle Coalition specifically for this contest. For example, you mentioned that you're one of the judges. How many, if you had to kind of break it down, how many judges are there? What kinds of things were discussed? I know it's an open submission, but could you talk a little bit about what the call for proposals is looking for, and what kinds of discussions were had at the table? As loudly as you can. Sorry, because it's just the buses and stuff.
I'm sorry if my voice is too low. So I'm going to tell you in all candor that I do not know 100% of the answers to these questions. Okay, so I am going to be on the jury of the Triangle Shirtwaist Memorial Design Competition. As conceived, it's a two-phase competition, so there's an open call, meaning anybody from anywhere in the world can submit a design idea for what is a difficult problem to solve, because it's not as though we have a big space and we're going to put a memorial. We have the surface of a building that is currently in use for a very different purpose. So it's a difficult design question being posed. And we're hoping for answers not only from architects and designers and landscape architects, but maybe poets and other kinds of creative thinkers. Who knows? We're open to everything. So those will be judged by a group of people. I am unclear now how many people are on the jury, but both the design fields like architecture and graphic design are represented, along with the Garment Workers Union, and I believe somebody from the Landmarks Preservation Commission or a historic commission from New York City. I'm not 100% sure of that, I will say, but it's a diverse jury representing the different voices that need to be heard in the discussion. We will narrow it to a much smaller group who will be given a small stipend. I believe it's 5, I'm not sure this is a final decision, who will be given a small stipend to further develop their design idea, and from those finalists we will choose a winner, which will then, as I understand it, hopefully be built and installed.
Great. I noticed that one of the requirements is outside of egress and those kinds of structural issues for a living space, for a living building, it also mentions that all of the names of the people who perished must be included. And in the Triangle Fire, that's 146 people. Why was that stipulation made as one of the design requirements?
You know, the using of names and the design of memorials, I believe in the end of the 20th century, we associate primarily with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. However, if you go around to small towns in America or small cities, or even if you walk into Macy's, in one of the stairwells, there's a list of the Macy's employees who lost their life in World War II. It catches your breath. You go to a small sailing community on the coast of Massachusetts, and there's a monument that lists the names of the men who lost their lives at sea feeding their city. The naming of names makes it personal. There's a first name and a last name. They're like you. their ages are important too. You can determine to a certain degree their ethnicity and perhaps begin to ruminate on their backgrounds when you read their names and maybe what brought them to the United States. Many of them were immigrants. Names tell a lot. I think without names it becomes much more of an abstraction. Names make it real.
For the design competition, what kinds of things are you looking for? In addition to including names, what are some of the other kind of stipulations or other things that you think would be important for an artist? You know, if this were watched by someone who is thinking about entering into the competition, what advice would you offer them, or what suggestions would you make, or ideas for them to think about?
In terms of what we're looking for in the design, we have no preconceptions. We want to see the best, most creative, inspiring idea that will cause someone who visits with intent or who passes by pure chance to feel what happened over 100 years ago. There are some stipulations within the lengthy list of requirements that have to do with not blocking windows on the existing building, and I believe having it be able to be removed for maintenance to the building and so on. But those, to me, the real limitations of practical requirements shouldn't get in the way of creative thinking, and we're going to be sifting through them for creative solutions that evoke the kind of complex, interesting feelings we as a design jury feel anybody who visits the site should feel. That's what the design needs to do. You know, writ large, if you've been to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, it's an experience. It quiets you. You know, it causes you to think. No matter what your feelings were or your politics were about the war itself, the loss of life and the reminder of that gives you pause. This, in a small way, the result of a very different set of conditions at a very different time, should still give you pause and make you think.
We've spoken quite a bit about Maya Lin's design and how revolutionary that was. It seems that I wouldn't say all, but many memorials that came after her also use reflective surfaces, particularly black granite. We see that with the 9/11 memorial as well. When you talk about affect, when you talk about the feelings that should be generated in that space, what kinds of feelings do you personally, outside of the competition, outside of your role as a judge, but as a woman, as an artist, as a New Yorker, what do you feel when you are in that space?
Well, what I hope the result of the successful winner to the design will create the feelings in me and in anybody else who goes there are this rich combination of a history of appreciation, a sadness and respect for those who lost their lives, an understanding of their role in changing how labor was accommodated and treated in the United States as a result of this tragedy. Like, out of this terrible thing, something good did come. So I think the internal response, mine and anybody else's, it has to be a rich and complex one. These people have been dead for a long time. It's no longer about the immediacy of the loss, obviously. It's more than 100 years ago. It's more about what came from it and about the richness of the city that it happened in and the richness of that city today.
Just to piggyback on what you said, I know because of the fire, we received a lot more protection for workers at the time, particularly in buildings with fire escapes and making sure that doors and windows weren't bolted and a lot of the horrific conditions that people were working under. However, when we think about the number of active unions that we have, a lot of the union busting that's happening, a lot of the kind of pressure that labor is under. Today we have less people in unions than ever before. What do you think that kind of says on this anniversary of the Triangle Fire? That while so many great things happened, if we look at the state of labor, a lot of questions are raised.
The state of labor in the United States is a really complex issue, I think, and I'm an architect, right? I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a social scientist in any way, and my personal politics are quite liberal, but I bring no knowledge to this, right? I just bring my own feelings. I think in some ways the role of early unions in the United States, the protection of a reasonable work week, not an insane work week. I believe the women in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire worked 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, and 7 days on Saturday. That's a long work week. And they were young. So child labor laws, workplace safety laws, reasonable work week laws, sick pay, overtime pay. Many of those things which didn't exist 100 years ago are now, people are protected a little bit more by the law. So perhaps in those circumstances, there's less of a role for a union, perhaps. One could certainly argue that. I think the exploitation of workers in many ways in this country goes in a way that unions can't help. You know, undocumented workers aren't going to join a union, they're terrified. So a union can't help them, and they are perhaps among the most exploited. Again, I speak with no knowledge on this, only with emotion and my own feelings about it, but I believe that for unions to remain relevant, they have to once again prove their value to the typical worker, and I'm not sure that they're doing that particularly successfully right now.
Thank you. I was just looking for your reflection. I wasn't looking for statistics or anything like that, but thank you for sharing.
It's complicated. Yeah, I don't know if it has any role in your thing, but I think it's a complicated issue.
Could you talk to me a little bit about, you're an architect, right?
Yes, yeah, I'm an architect.
And I can't really define architecture, I'm sure many people have tried, but basically thinking about how people experience the space around them and how that could be used. Could you define how you see architecture to be?
Well, architects design buildings that get built, but many buildings that get built are not designed by architects. They're in effect just built. You know, you need X amount of space, you draw a box around it, you put the walls up. I believe that when architects design buildings or spaces or interiors or exteriors, they design with an idea. Now, in some instances, that idea has to do with how people feel. I want to make people feel better, warmer, happier. I want to make them think. But an architect might also be, I'm designing a concert hall, the most important thing to me is the quality of the sound, or I'm designing a monument and it needs to be impactful on the city street, or I'm designing a home for battered women and most important thing it needs to do is provide a sense of security. And then once you've asked the questions of what the building or structure or space need to do, you think about how you're going to answer them. So every architect does that differently. Am I doing it with materials? Am I doing it with form? Am I doing it with an allusion to the past? Am I doing it with an attempt to make it look like what I think the future should be? And so all of these things come together. You know, an architect solves dozens and dozens of, answers dozens and dozens of questions simultaneously. Some of them are code related. You know, does it meet code? Does it meet safety? Is it buildable? Is it environmentally sustainable? Will it keep the rain out? And does it meet the program? You know, if you need 6 bedrooms and it only has 5, it's not working. There's all of that kind of practical stuff, and then there's the poetry of being sure that architecture is a language, that it says what you, the architect, want it to say.
Great.
Okay.
I was wondering, as any artist, you must experience this. How does one balance this kind of point of view, this sharing of a creative idea or inspiration, along with budgetary constraints. We know in cities like New York, since we've had serious foreclosure issues, we've had not as badly as other cities, but certainly a financial crisis of 2007, 2008. How does one balance all of the creativity that they have along with budgetary constraints? Certainly with this memorial, I know the Triangle Fire Coalition is trying to raise money, but the memorial that gets built is going to be constrained with the amount of money that the coalition can raise. So how does one approach that tension?
So the question of budget and architecture, you could put a positive spin on it and say that all constraints within reason help contribute to creative, thoughtful solutions. So a budget is no different than a building code or an accessibility code or an environmental performance code. These are things that standards and criteria you must meet in the process of making your building. That's what you have to do. You could be less positive and say, boy, budgets are a huge limitation, and in every instance, budget has to be consistent with aspiration. So simple things done on a small budget can be as powerful as flamboyant things done on a large budget, but there has to be an alignment between budget and aspiration. And I think any good architect, whatever the style of their work, satisfies that criteria. It's just part of what's necessary to do in order to be an architect.
I was wondering if we could go back as well. You mentioned that the story of the Triangle Fire tragedy has always been with you, right? Between your mother being a fashion designer and you being a native New Yorker growing up in the city, it's kind of a story that's always been a part of you. If you had to tell that story, what do you think would be some of the lessons that we can learn from it today?
I would say, interestingly enough, one of the most poignant lessons to me about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, to me as an architect, is not about building safety, because we've satisfied those requirements. What it is about the relationship between employer and employee and the nature of collaborative making of things. As an architect, I don't work alone. I work not only with all the people who work for me, but with all the people we work with, contractors, engineers, consultants, and clients and users. What happened in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is that the two owners of that factory had the doors locked, not because they were afraid of people getting in, but because they were afraid of their own employees getting out and stealing things or taking an illicit break. If we've learned anything as we've gone 100 years forward in the relationship between employer and employee, is that we're in this together, and if you can't trust your employees, then you are really doing something wrong. That, to me, is the lesson. I don't know.
Sure. That's a really good point. Something that happened in the Newark factory fire, this is in addition to a lot of all of the doors being bolted shut, but they even arranged the desks in such a way
that you couldn't get out,
that women couldn't easily even use the restroom.
Yeah, because they didn't want you to waste time.
Because they didn't want them to waste time. And the Newark factory fire happened on November 26th, so it was less than a month before Christmas. So all of the girls, many of them were as young as 16. They were actually younger on the aggregate than the New York women. A lot of the girls were told that if they brought their sister or cousin or girlfriend in that day to help with the crunch before Christmas, they would be given an extra $2 for having their friend work. So at the time,
oh my God,
there were actually
twice as many workers in there.
Twice as many workers, many of whom even their names weren't written down for the records because they were just day laborers.
How many people died in that fire?
26 people died because a lot of them were able to be evacuated out. However, the 26 that died a really terrible death. There was a metal picket fence that surrounded the factory.
I don't know anything about that fire.
So most of them were impaled as they tried to jump.
As opposed to just being squished on the sidewalk.
Which is also horrific. Right?
Yeah.
But
it's interesting, when we first started talking, and I need to bring this to a close, when we first started talking, you raised the question of what gets memorialized and what doesn't. And I think that's a really interesting question. I live uptown near the East River, and other than the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and September 11th, the biggest loss of life in New York City, I believe, was the General Slocum sinking, right, which was a pleasure boat filled with people of limited means who didn't know how to swim, who were going off for a day in the sun, and the boat sank, right? And they drowned. I don't even know the number, but it was a lot of people. And there is no marker anywhere along the long promenade on the East River to the General Slocum tragedy that I know of or that I have ever seen. And I wonder about that. So I know some New York City history, and I'm interested in this stuff. But when one looks out at those roiling waters, you really have no sense of what happened here. And you think to yourself, so why is that? What gets remembered and what doesn't, and why is a question I have no answer to, but it's a fascinating question. And being in the public spotlight for your tragedy, which means being in New York, let's say, as opposed to being in Newark, is clearly part of it. Having a champion well beyond the life of the tragedy is another part of it, and that can come from the most unusual circumstances. Who knows what the reasons for that are. So I think that too is a complex issue that we should ask ourselves about as a culture, as society. Why do we choose to remember and memorialize what we do?